Okay. So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today we welcome you once more to a C3C Encontro Ciência. The talk will be recorded, so I ask anyone who does not want to appear to keep the video turned off. This video will later be available on CE3C YouTube channel. Today we have as our speaker, and we are quite pleased to have Professor Brian Huntley from CIBIO. You can leave questions to Professor during the talk through the chat, or at the end you can ask directly. Professor will be presented by Professor Luís Catarino, to whom I now give the floor. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and everyone here in the Faculty of Sciences and in the net. I hope to have some colleagues from Angola too, because today at the Ciência meeting we have a lecture by Professor Brian Huntley, whom I thank for accepting my invitation. Professor Huntley is a conservation scientist over 50 years of field research and management experience in many African countries. He has initiated and led successful conclusion several major interdisciplinary cooperative research and institutional development projects. Yes, we are starting. Professor Huntley visited over 50 countries as an invited speaker and reviewer of biodiversity conservation activities. Following the retirement as CEO of South African National Biodiversity Institute, Professor Huntley has been engaged in as an independent consultant and conservation research and implementation projects in several African countries, and in reviews of conservation projects around the world for various for several United Nations agencies. Presently, he is an invited researcher at CIBIO, a research associate in the Center of Invasion Biology at Stellenbosch University, and an emeritus professor at the University of Cape Town. For a long time, he has a passion for the landscapes and biodiversity of Angola, sustained for over 50 years since his appointment in 1971 as an ecologist in the national parks of Angola. He coordinated the edition of the book Biodiversity of Angola, reference work available in Portuguese and English, and continues to work on the ecology and biodiversity of Angola. In today's talk, Professor Huntley will present an African perspective on the biomes, ecoregions, and structure and functioning of Angolan terrestrial ecosystems. Also, he will provide an outline of a new textbook prepared specifically for Angolan students to be published by CIBIO in both English and Portuguese open access editions. Professor Huntley, please make your presentation. Thank you.
Agora já está.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I hope that you can hear me clearly. Is this the case?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, well, what I want to discuss this afternoon is just some ideas about the ecology of the terrestrial biomes and ecoregions of Angola, which I think are essential baselines for anybody researching in the field of biology in Angola, whether it's biology or landscape ecology or environmental sciences. I think it's important for all researchers in Angola, particularly the young students, to have a good feel and understanding of the systems of Angola. So I am going to give a synopsis of the key messages, ecological messages from the textbook that Professor Luis Catarino referred to. And firstly, I must thank Luis for inviting me to this session. I've just got to see the mechanism here. Sorry, this is this one. Yeah, that's what I've been pushing. It's not working. Sorry, we just have a slight technical delay here. Yeah, well, okay. Do you want to remove this from the top of the screen? Okay. Well, the key elements that I'm going to be discussing are the key determinants of the evolution, structure, and functioning of the biomes, the main patterns and characteristics of the biodiversity of Angola, and in particular, the evidence, new evidence from recent research, which supports old concepts which need to be re-examined and tested. And then finally, just ideas on future research and the way forward. The first topic is about the determinants. What are the main determinants for the evolution, structure, and function of Angolan's biomes and ecosystems? And there are half a dozen of these. There's the geological history, the geomorphological evolution, topography, climate, soils, natural fires, and land use. And each one of these factors has a very very special way in which it affects the interactions and distribution and functioning of the very rich biodiversity of Angola. Firstly, it's the geological foundations. Any visitor to Angola might be overwhelmed by the seeming diversity of the geology and soils and topography. But basically, there are two main blocks. There is along the spine, the north-south spine of the western side of the country, of the old rocks, Precambrian crystalline rocks, which produce a ferritic soil and covers about 25% of Angola. To the east, you have the Kalahari sands, which are much more recent. They're sands, as the name suggests, and they cover 50% of Angola. So if you know those two main geological formations, you've already got your head around 75% of Angola's basement, its foundation. Next are the tectonics, the geomorphological history of Angola. Of course, it goes back to the breakup of Gondwana 180 million years ago, the separation of Africa from South America, the establishment of the Atlantic Ocean, and more specifically, the rise of the Miombe and Bear swells, the highlands that came up with the rising of the land under Cabinda and under Bahia, which has produced those highlands there. And then also the establishment of the two great basins, the Congo and the Kalahari basins, into which the rivers flood, and in the case of the Kalahari, the sands moved over millions of years. Then more recently, about 10 million years ago, you had the development of the Benguela Current, and with that, the accentuation of the formation of the Namib Desert. So these major tectonic events were part of an ongoing planation or erosion across the whole continent of Africa, and forming these extensive plains, which you see specifically in central Angola, the long and then down into the Quandra-Kabongo. It's called the African or post-African penny plains, which is a primary feature of much of Central Africa. And with that geomorphological understanding of the past, one can look at the more recent evolution of the climate. And of course, Angola is exceptionally rich in its biodiversity and ecosystem diversity because its precipitation ranges from 1,600 millimeters up in the north to down to 30 to 100 millimeters in the south. So you've got the rainforests of Cabinda down to the desert of the Namib. Now, what creates this? And it's important to understand that Angola is lying at a particular latitude, which in the north, you've got what is called the Intertropical Convergence Zone, an area of low atmospheric pressure with cyclonic moist air rising up, and of course the high rainfall that results from that. Whereas if you go down to the south, you move into an area of high pressure, stable air with an inversion layer, with on the coast particularly, the clouds just, although they rise off the ocean, they get trapped under inversion. As you can see in this little diagram here, where, oops, go back again. Oh, wait a sec, let me go up there. You've got from the north, the high intensity rainfall of cumulonimbus clouds, like you can see in this photograph on the left, where I was flying just a few weeks ago across 10,000 meters above Cabinda. You see the massive cumulonimbus clouds, whereas just further south on the right, where you're flying over Namibia and Mozambique, the stratus, the low stratus clouds, which are only up to sort of 500 meters, get blocked by that inversion layer. And in fact, they dry out before they reach the coast. And that's why you've got the desert there. So there are these two climatic, atmospheric features of Angola, which are quite unique because no other African country has both the Intertropical Convergence Zone and this very arid zone below it. Another factor, of course, an ancient factor, going back at least 300 million years, are natural fires. It's not something that is a man-made feature, although it's been accentuated in the last centuries. Fire is a natural phenomenon. It evolved the tropical savannas about 10 million years ago. It's a fundamental feature of the Miombo or the Panda mesic savanna biome. It is a feature which has been driving the ecology of Africa for, as I say, the last 10 million years. And recently, scientists have started looking at the patterns, the so-called fire regimes of fires across the world, but particularly Africa, and looking at what they call pyromes, like biomes, pyromes, which express different types of fire regime. And here in this map of Africa, of Angola, you can see how the frequency of fires in different parts of Angola differs quite markedly. And with that, of course, a marked difference in the vegetation responses. And then finally, in terms of these factors that mold the biodiversity and create the patterns, are another form of consumers. One tends to think of consumers only as animals, but consumers include fire, and consumers include the mammal herbivores. And recent analyses by Gareth Hempson and others have looked at the distribution of herbivores across Africa and come out with the term herbivomes. So you've got biomes, pyromes, and herbivomes, which is a new language for ecologists, but it's quite interesting because the patterns that one sees in looking at the distribution of the mammalian herbivores, you'll see some patterns which will come out later. But I mean, quite simply, the bulk feeders, the green, includes all the miombo, the moist or mesic savannas. The arid zone feeders are of the arid savannas. And of course, the forest duiker are typical of the Guinea-Congolian forest. So these patterns are starting to emerge about the biodiversity and ecology of a country like Angola, which you see on this map is quite central. It gets components of all those different features. So what a summary then quickly of the key determinants of Angolan ecological structure and functioning. I use a quote from philosopher, German-English philosopher, CIBIO. He said, to understand is to perceive pattern. And that's a good message. If you're an ecologist, it's all about pattern. You want to see what are the patterns that you see in nature. And in the case of Angola, I mentioned two major geological formations, the ancient crystalline Precambrian basement and the recent Kalahari sands, four major geomorphological features, the African planation surface, the swells, the basins, the escarpment, two major atmospheric systems, wet low pressure, the ITCZ, and the dry high pressure anticyclones of the south, and then two main consumers, fires, exhibited by pyromes, and herbivores, described in terms of herbivorms. So that gives you the sort of the foundational information you need to know about Angola. It's actually quite simple, but it's to know that you're on a very good step towards getting a clearer understanding of what you see. Now, how is this reflected in the main patterns of Angola's biodiversity? One first analysis we did a few years ago and produced in the Biodiversity of Angola book was an analysis of the biomes, the regions, the vegetation types, vascular plants. Angola's probably got about 7,000 vascular plants at least. At the time, there were 6,850 documented, but I'm quite sure there are probably another several hundred still to be described and catalogued. And the same with butterflies and dragonflies and amphibians. Each one of those statistics there comes from the book published 2 years ago. I know from my colleagues who are doing research, for instance, on the dragonflies, another 30 species have been added to that list in the last 2 years. With amphibians, there are about 20. Reptiles, there are half a dozen. So the numbers are growing all the time. But that gives you just a picture of the extremely rich diversity of Angola's fauna and flora. Looking also at the bigger picture of Africa, one wants to connect Angola to the rest of the continent. And here I've been revisiting our understanding of biomes in terms of savannas. More fundamental, for instance, we all know are the Mediterranean climate systems that we've got up in the north of Africa and down the south of the Cape. The Guinea-Congolian rainforest in central and the Congo Basin and down towards including Cabinda. The Afro-montane systems, which include Mount Morco and the forests of Namba. And then the two savanna types, mesic savanna and arid savanna. And I'll give some emphasis to those two while touching on the desert and then not mapped here, the mangrove biomes. But Angola includes 7 of the 9 biomes recognized for Africa by WWF. It's the higher than any other country in Africa. Angola has more diversity at biomes. And in terms of ecoregions, in terms of WWF's map, it has 15 ecoregions. It's second only to South Africa in terms of richness. So, you know, there's something exceptional about Angola, and it makes it a marvelous place for any student. It's just unbeatable in terms of looking for diversity. You've got it in Angola. What is important, I think, for any student of Angola's particular vegetation and flora is just to understand the context in terms of centers of endemism. And there are 4 main centers for Africa, as described by Frank White about 50 years ago. People have revised these and fine-tuned them and remapped them, but basically for the student, you don't need to know much more than the fact there are four. There's the Guinea-Congolian, the Afro-Montane, Zambesian, and Karoo-Namib. Now, the important thing in Angola is that the Zambesian regional center of endemism covers about 80% or 90% of Angola. So the Guinea-Congolian components, about 16% if you throw in the transition zones of the moist savannas up in the north. But others like the Afro-Montane is less than 1%, Karoo-Namib's about 2%. But the fact is, these typical African centers of endemism are represented in Angola, and no other African country has that diversity from looking at the floristic evolution of Africa's flora. Just some snapshots to show you up in Cabinda, the nature of the vegetation. You might be able to spot that there's a man standing at the base of that big tree with the buttress roots there. You can see how big that is. That photograph I took in 1971, before most of you were students. That tree is unfortunately no longer there. It's just on the road to Dalatando. That was a little bit of coffee forest. The other tree on the bottom right, I think you can barely see the gentleman standing there, but that's an amazing big tree next to the Luangwa River there, and that's also disappeared, sadly. Going to the transition, the transition from the Guinea-Congolian forests down into the Zambesian savannas, you get these wonderful gallery forests between the woodlands and grasslands and open savannas of Miombo. And there you see the nature of the landscapes of that great interior of Angola. And then further south, as you dry out, you go down into the areas of Diabortia, Baikia, Terminalia, a drier woodland, but also part of the more moist savannas. Up in the highlands, Mount Morkel, you've got the little relic forests, Afro-Montane forests, and even elements of Cape flora, Philippia, Protea, Erica up on the top of Mount Morkel. And of course, the escarpment and the Inselberg, such as Serra de Neve, recently being more intensely studied, and the Karoo-Namib, the deserts of the Namib. So that's a sort of outline of the main biomes of Angola. Now, what I want to give a little focus to is new evidence and principles that support old ideas of patterns and process. Savanna ecology has undergone a considerable revolution over the last 20 or so years. The amount of work that's been done in the savannas of Africa, Brazil, and particularly Australia has brought a lot of new thinking together. Well, I say last 20 years, probably over the last 40 years. And this I have tried to apply to the situation in Angola. If one goes back just 40 years ago, we had a workshop in South Africa. I organized getting savanna ecologists from Australia, South America, and Africa together to rethink savannas. And one fairly fundamental outcome of this was the recognition that tropical savannas are defined by C4 grasses, the grasses that evolved during the drier parts of the Miocene, 15 to 20 million years ago, in response to seasonality and climate and the advent of fires. And so the tropical savannas, whether you're in the Cerrado of Brazil or in the Miombo of Angola or in the mulga of Australia, they all have C4 grasses. That's the defining factor. And grasses are co-dominant with fire and herbivore tolerant, but shade intolerant trees. And this relationship to shade tolerance and fire are fundamental, as we'll see later in this presentation. The map on the right there is just a map that we did describing these two very different systems of the arid eutrophic savannas. The soils are richer and more nutrient rich, and the mesic dystrophic savannas of Africa. And that theme has underpinned a lot of what I will say, and which is being described more and more in recent research by scientists around the world. And one way of looking at this is to look at the world in terms of three main drivers. A green world, which is a high importance of shade tolerance. That is, trees that will grow and germinate and grow to maturity under the shade of other trees. They are shade tolerant, but fire intolerant. And those are the forests. Then you have the black world, which is mesic savannas, where fire is the key factor. Fire drives the system function. Then thirdly, the arid savannas, or the brown world, which is where there's a high importance of browsing and grazing, herbivores. So herbivores, fire, and shade as the three axes in which determine the vegetation of tropical Africa. And going back over evolutionary time, there was this one step forward where trees coming out of the forests, you think of most of the Cretaceous, most of the recent past, the last 70 million years, the tropics were covered by trees or forests rather. With the drying out in the Miocene and the seasonality of climate, fire became important. And trees, fire-tolerant trees and C4 grasses started opening up. And phylogenetic studies have shown that in Brazil, in the Cerrado of Brazil, and the moist savannas of Africa, the fire-adapted woody clades, the taxonomic groups of the trees that were fire-adapted emerged. And you can see how from about 10 million years ago, that arrow pointing the timeline, the number of trees of these or species from these fire-adapted clades just started to surge over that last 10 million years, showing the evolution of this fire-adapted flora. Interestingly, too, studies on the evolution of the bovids, the antelope, over the last 10 million years, the same time period, you can see how the antelope, the bovids, were increasing in numbers and numbers of lineages, but simultaneously to that, spiny plants were. So this is another key. You've got, in the one case, this fire adaptation emerging since the Miocene. In the other case, you've got spiny plants like acacias, and all the plants you get in the arid savannas. And these are this is new evidence over the last dozen years or more that is showing this evolution of these two savanna types. The last point is that what do we mean by arid and what is mesic? And a study here by Sankarian and colleagues published 15 years, a bit more than 15 years ago, looking at the tree cover under the rainfall regimes across Africa, about 400 data points, that showed that the woody cover of African savannas is a function of mean annual rainfall and fire. Below 650 millimeters a year, rainfall determines tree woody cover. And that line of 650 is significant because 40 years ago, when we did that Savannah book, we also used 650 millimeters as sort of dividing line between arid savannas and mesic savannas. And this is now shown that above 650 millimeters, tree cover is dependent not on rainfall, but on fire. Below it, it's dependent not on fire, because very little fire occurs in those dry areas, and it's more rainfall factor, at least more a fire factor. And then the question that I want to put to Portuguese scientists is, what is a savanna? When is a savanna, and when is a forest a forest? And this is fundamental, because in the translation of the book that I've just completed on the ecology of Angola, the one stumbling block is the language, the wording and understanding of words like savanna and forest. And Francophone and Lusophone people talk of forest when they are not really talking about forests. They're talking about woodlands or savannas. And here, this study by Carla Stave and others showed that in terms of the frequency of tree cover in huge samples across Africa, where fire is present, tree cover very seldom goes above 50% tree cover. Once you take fire away, you get the tree cover growing until you've got forest. And once you've got forest, fire can't get in, and you've got shade-tolerant seedlings. And so you've got a different thing, which we call forest. And in terms of Angola, you've got the Matas do Mopanda, the Miombo, which is not forest. The French and the Portuguese and even some Germans call it forest. It's not forest. It's a woodland within the savanna biome. Pacienza, we'll work on this yet. We'll work on this. Now let me just show you something very interesting. About in the 1970s, I did a bit of a study of savannas in different parts of the world. And these are paired photographs. On the left, in the Miombo, and the second one is in the Cerrado of Brazil. Those two photographs, for untrained eye, I would say it looks just like ordinary sort of Miombo woodland. The one is in Brazil, the one is in Angola. On the right, you have again one in South Africa, sort of equivalent to Miombo, and the far right is in Brazil, just outside of Brasilia. And you'd think they're on the same continent. And there was the sort of father of savanna ecology in Brazil, a gentleman called Mario Ferri, took me into the field, and he described to me what he thought was a uniquely Brazilian thing called tortuosity. It's a good tortuosidade. And he said these trees, you can see this one on the right, you see how it's tortuous. It goes like this. And I went home and I took a photograph of a tree in our study site, which is also tortuous. And that's related to fire. Fire burns, and that's a typical moist savanna scene. Look at those two landscapes. The one on the left at the top, I could take many Angolans and say, now what part of Angola is this photograph? And they say, oh, it's over towards the Quantacubango, it's just along this area here, it's up more to Lundas. Yeah? Well, actually, it's in Brazil, just north of Brasilia. And the one on the right, the low there, that is just on the south of Lagoa Corumbu. Both of them are on similar soils, old African or old landscapes, the penny plains of central Brazil, the penny plains of Central Africa, and both at about 1,000 meters. Same climate, everything. And it's quite difficult not to get confused. You think that those, they're both from somewhere in Angola. And now go a bit further afield into the arid savannas. If you go into Rajasthan in India, you'll find just like on the top left, that's in Rajasthan, on the top right, after a good summer rainfall, that is just inland of Benguela, Acacia savanna. Acacia savanna in India, Acacia savanna in Benguela. Below, it's in Argentina, in the Chaco. That just looks like ordinary African acacia savanna. On the bottom right, you've got mimosas, they same family, same subfamily. And instead of having tree euphorbias, you have cactaceae, cactus. But structurally they're the same, functionally they're the same, arid savannas. And while I'm on this, I had an email this morning asking me to explain something about an area like you see up on the top right, that's Bikwa National Park, familiar to some of you. And you see the pattern there. And I said, well, that pattern is what we call the catena. The catena is a basic concept in ecology that an Angolan ecologist must understand. On the top right, left-hand corner, you've got the map done by Brito Teixeira 50 years ago. He had no satellite imagery. And look at, it looks like a thumbprint, eh? Looks just like a thumbprint, but it's actually the rising and falling of the landscape, which you see perfectly with the satellite image. But Brito Teixeira was a good botanist, a good vegetation scientist, and he did a map which is almost identical to the map of the satellite image 50 years later. And there you can see the pattern on the bottom two slides, where you see the grasslands at the bottom of the Molola and going up through different woodland types to at the top of the rise, you've got Baike woodland, not forest. I won't go into these details of the distinctions between arid eutrophic and mesic dystrophic savannas, but they are functionally different, not only in themselves in terms of their species composition and structure, but also in terms of the drivers, whether it's fire or herbivory, or whether it's nutrient-rich soils or nutrient-poor soils. It's a very distinctive ecology that they have. And when you put this all together, you can look at the actual dynamics of the ecosystem. And the two ecosystems, although at a glance for an untrained eye, they might look similar because they're trees and grasses and shrubs and things, they function very differently. The one has, the arid savanna has high nutrient availability, high nutrient uptake, leaf nutrient concentration is high, primary productivity is high, return of nutrients to the soil, etc. It's a particular biogeochemical cycle that occurs there, and it's very distinctive to that mesic savanna. So you can look at basic structure, function, and then the biochemistry of it, and it all fits these two different, call them classes of biomes, so the mesic and the arid savannas. Okay, so I'm jumping ahead a little bit now and saying what needs to be studied more intensively. Well, obviously everything in Angola needs more researchers. So there's room for thousands of researchers. There are two forms of research. There's curiosity-driven research and management-driven research. And there should be space for both of those because, many scientists are curious about all sorts of things that might not have any immediate use. Others are more driven by finding immediate solutions to immediate problems. But in Angola, there's a bit of everything. One of the real curiosities in Namib, of course, is what we call the fairy circles. And there you can see in the bottom left there, down in Iona, these little patches, bare patches. And when my wife and I first went to Iona 51 years ago, we were told by Senor Tito, Velho Tito, the game ranger there, who was an old man that spent 70 years in the desert. And he said, no, that's where the zebras roll. they rolled to get the the ticks off them. So he said, no, there aren't enough zebras to make, because there are millions of these. But then he said, oh, but there's also, that might have been shooting stars, asteroids coming down. And then the discussion went to ants, termites, self-organization, soil crusts, allelopathy. Now, for the last 20 years, there's been quite a lot of research done on this. And after 20 years of research by Germans, Americans, South Africans, Portuguese, everybody's got a different answer. So there's still special chance to go and do some studies on that for the curious scientists. Up in the Miombo, you've got some of these strange circular forests, patches, not forests, woodlands, dense woodlands, where you have around them, you see the white pattern, bare white soil around the edge of the forest. And nobody's come up with any explanation. There's some thoughts about it, but it's like a PhD study waiting for somebody to work on, just to explain, because there's something is happening there, and anybody's guess. Then something that fascinates me are the bondeiros. Angola has the biggest diversity of baobab structure. You know, if you go up to, well, if we start that photo on the top there is a dwarf baobab on the road to Mosambikis. If you go down to Mosambikis, 40 kilometers out of Mosambikis, stop the car and walk into the veld. And within 200, 300 meters, you'll start finding dwarf bondeiros, miles and miles away from any other bondeiros. If well, we can go just back there. Those are more typical ones down the bottom there. But this photograph here down on the Kuneni, now Chitado, you can see that big tree there. But if you look in the bottom corners, you've got dwarf baobab, and then not very well exposed on the right bottom, also a dwarf baobab that is growing in the middle of the desert, just a few hundred meters from the Atlantic Ocean, the Busira, south, about 100 kilometers south of Busira. It's an isolated baobab. It's about 5 meters by 5 meters. And it's 50 kilometers from any other baobab. I visited after quite a difficult trip to find it. And it had flowers, but the fruit was not fertile. So I mean, this studying Angola should be its national plant. The Belwichia is the national plant, but then Bondeira should be the national plant. And there's nobody doing a PhD on the Bondeira. I don't know, Professor, why? What's up? And then another one, the termitaria. Angola's got an incredible diversity of termitaria, and the termites are the main architects of many Angolan ecosystems. But who's working on them? And then another one that has confused people for the last 150 years are the underground forests, the geoxiles. They are trees that grow underground. So that color that you can see is not grass. Those are the leaves of trees that are growing underground. And they can spread out over, a single tree can spread over, 10 meters. It's like if you were to get a tree, a big tree, and just cover it with sand, and then the leaves just come out the top. And some German researchers have been working with Angolan researchers for the last 20 years on aspects of this. They increasingly start talking about frost being the factor. Now, I've spent a lot of time in Angola, and I've got many, many friends who've spent a lot of time in Angola. There are parts of Angola where you do get frost, and quite important. But for the Lundas and across into Zambia and up into Tanzania, frost is non-existent. And the greatest diversity of this occurs in areas where frost has not occurred recently. I think it's to do with the soil-water relations and adaptation to various aspects of fire delivery. It's a lot of factors, but again, it's something to study. And then perhaps the most important important threat to the vegetation and the livelihoods in Angola are invasive plants. I did a survey there, 4,000 kilometers over 2 weeks with this gentleman here in this photograph. That's Dave Richardson. He's the most cited scientist in Africa. He's got over 80,000 citations. So that's, man, he's listed globally as one of the top 20 out of the 1,000 ecologists that have been reviewed. And Dave Richardson and I and another student of his did a 4,000 kilometer trip through Angola about 5 years ago. And we found the most threatening invasive plant of Angola is the puntia, the cactus. From Lubango, you go down the escarpment, you go all the way to Benguela, you go to Kisama, you go north from Kisama. This cactus is covering the landscape, and it prevents cattle grazing. You can't plant your crops there. It's a real problem, and it can be controlled. In Kruger National Park, they've controlled it with biological control methods, as the Australians have done in Australia and saved millions and millions of hectares of agricultural land. The other one on the right there is Dave Richardson with acacia, acacia, what is that, Mearnsia. Where did we find that? We found that it's one of the worst invasives in South Africa, in the more temperate parts of South Africa. And where do we find it? We found it in the new parking area for Tundavala. At Tundavala, you go to Lubango, you go up to Tundavala, and what do you find? That the municipality has planted in the parking the worst invasive. In South Africa, they are spending over 100 million euros a year on invasive plant management. And there, in front of our eyes, we found that they'd chosen this terrible, terrible plant to plant. And I'm sure it's, it's probably a big tree flowering through. So invasive species research. And then finally, the last two areas for research on the impact of charcoal production on the biodiversity. There's so many ways of looking at it. I mean, you don't have to go to Angola. You use your satellite imagery and technology to look at that. You need ground truthing. And cattle eating Welwitschia. There's your Professor Sorodio de Almeida when he was a young man 50 years ago. I'm sure some of you know Sorodio de Almeida. Olha lá, jovem at that big Welwitschia. But what's happening, the cattle are eating it because the government's put poços, furos, pumps for water for the cattle to go. There's no grass for the cattle, so what do they do? The cattle eat the Welwitschia. The role of fire, we've been doing at this university work on the role of fire, and then of course on bushmeat. These are all research topics for Angolan students. So what is the paradox about Angola? It is a country rich in biodiversity, but poor in data. We're getting more data, but if you look at the GBIF map of Africa, and you can see Angola, the borders of Angola, that area where there's just no data. So there's lots of work to be done. Finally, the way ahead. How can we incentivize a new generation of Angolan biologists? We started a program in 1995. We called Sabanet, and certain important ladies in Angola, I won't mention names, were my liaison and the chairman of, well, Liz Martos was the original chairman, and then another young lady took over as chairman of the Sabanet program. She's going to be very important, I hear, in Angola. So maybe we'll get her to sponsor field trips like this. This was a field trip to Malawi, to Nyika Plateau, That's what young botanists should be doing in the field, collecting plants. Can you imagine the checklist of Kisama if you had a team going and doing that survey there now and collecting so many plants just in 2 weeks? Okay, so get them in the field. We had an expedition to Lubango and Mamip in 2009. You can see we had a good bunch we had 15 students there from Angola and 30 scientists from different parts of the world. And then we had another one up to the northeast to Karumbu. One of the men in this photograph became the director of the National Biodiversity Institute a few years later. And, you know, you want to get people into the field. So I say the sky is the limit. Seize the day. Thank you. You want to come up here?
Thank you very much. It was a great presentations. So now we have time for questions or through the online version or directly.
Yes, I have a couple of more questions or comments, but if anyone from Angola too have questions or comments, please do it. Se tiverem comentários, nomeadamente pessoas de Angola e pessoas que gostem de Angola, podem fazer comentários, inclusivamente em português, que podemos traduzir para o professor André, que aliás também percebe português e também fala português.
Agora estamos a ouvir-vos um pouquinho mal. Já está.
Ouvem melhor agora? Ok.
Sim.
Well, about one question or one critical discussion about the terminology of forest, woodland, and savanna. I think in Portuguese and in French, namely, we have a problem that we don't have a word for woodland. We have just for forest and for savanna. And so we to name a woodland, there is no forest sensu stricto and no savanna. We use floresta aberta, open forest.
Professora, se calhar peço-lhe só para virar o microfone um bocadinho mais para si que...
Ok, então sim. And so there are some difficulty and there are some confusion about the vegetation types or the naming of vegetation types, namely in the ecotone from savanna, from herbaceous savanna to savanna woodland, to woodland, and to forest. Myself, I prefer to use in English to use forest only for dense forest, woodland for a kind of vegetation dominated by trees, but with a large cover of herbs, namely grasses, and the savanna for a vegetation dominated by herbs, including or not shrubs and trees.
Yeah.
But I think it is an important question, and we have no word for woodland in Latin languages.
Yes. No, I appreciate that, and I noticed that Granval Barbosa use the term bosch a bit for that woodland. But I don't see it being used much in Portuguese other than by Granville Barbosa. Bosch perhaps is a bit not a good term.
Well, bosque, I think in Portuguese, bosque is a small forest. But small in terms of surface area.
Yeah. Okay.
Another comment.
Professor, acho que seria melhor rodar mesmo o microfone para si, por favor. Okay.
Another question about an important issue. It is the use of trees to make charcoal. Raquel, in his ongoing PhD, she's working about charcoal production in Willa and in Miombo and Mopan forests. A curious achievement is that both in Miombo and Mopan forests, the species used to make charcoal, they are sprouters, and so it is a little bit feasible to get biomass from the forest or from the woodland, if there is no so intensive use, maybe the system can be can have some resilience to the harvest for charcoal. But when we make not only charcoal but agriculture, the kills are effectively killed.
Yeah.
But just for charcoal, if there are no controlled pressure, the system can be a little bit sustainable.
Yeah. Well, good, always good to have something positive coming out of research, and one hopes that if there's a sustainable management approach to the resprouting Miombo trees and give them perhaps 30 years to recover their full biomass, it's at least is a positive bit of evidence. Yes.
We have a question from Paulo Souza. Paulo?
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I have a question. Why are mesic savannas less productive than arid savannas?
Well, it's all in the soil. The mesic savannas, if you simplify the whole sort of the situation, they are on the older soils, the old soils of the penny plains. Like if you take a typical example, the Miombo of Melange, or in parts of the Quandracabango, it's on poor nutrient poor soils, and so
we lost the connection.
Yeah.
We lost you for some time. Now
okay.
We can hear you again.
Okay, let me just try again. In simplistic terms, the mesic savannas are on old, nutrient poor, usually slightly acidic soils, and despite the high rainfall and the biomass that is produced, it's slow growing. It's not as nutritious to herbivores. There are very few ungulate herbivores in the mesic savannas. Like a typical area would be Luandu Reserve or Kangandala. However, in the arid savannas, the soils are usually younger, they richer nutritionally. They produce grasses and trees which are nutritious for ungulates, for antelope. They carry a high antelope population in many areas. So there are these two distinct sort of nutrition cycles that I showed in that one diagram in these two savanna types. But that is a simplistic answer to the question, because if you look what has happened in Brazil, the Cerrado has been transformed into agricultural landscapes through the addition of fertilizers. So if you've got a good rainfall with a moderate soil and you add fertilizer, you can get the agricultural production which you have in Brazil. You know, one of the highest agricultural producers of the world. Now, there have been studies done in recent years, in the last dozen years, by Brazilian scientists in Angola, indicating approaches to transforming Angola's Miombo into an agricultural hotspot. Because there's the area, there's the water, but it's just the actual management of fertility of the soil that has to be solved. But the Brazilians have solved it. So, you know, it's all around the fertility of the soil rather than anything else. It's a rather sort of simplistic answer, Paulo.
Thanks. I just have one more question. May I do it or?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thanks.
There's no other.
In the beginning of the presentation, you talked about the herbivores on several different ecosystems. No, the ecosystems were defined by which type of herbivores there were there. But I think in savannas, one of the biggest herbivores is actually the termites. Am I wrong or?
Yeah, no, you're quite right. That sort of simplified what they call the herbivorms, was looking at the large mammal herbivores. But you're right that in terms of total biomass, for many areas, particularly in the mesic savannas, termites, and very often termites that are living subterraneously, although I showed slides of them above the ground, the big spikes coming out of the ground. There are many termites that are active underground, so you don't even know that they're there. So hence the emphasis I put on studies on termite ecology in African systems, which I think is neglected as a field for ecologists.
Thank you. I don't know if there are any other questions.
If there are no questions, I have one little question. To me, the Angaras on what or shamans on what are a fascinating type of vegetation, subterranean forest with little branches above the soil. And so even there are some results.
Estamos outra vez com algumas dificuldades. Sorry. I don't know if maybe try to put a bit far from you, maybe, because we are listening quite well, Professor Brian. So I'm not sure if it is the position.
Okay.
Yes, I think now it's okay.
I think even there are some results on the structure, the ecology, and composition of Angaras de Angola. I think for now it is not completely explained why we have islands of dwarf vegetation inside the Miombo, for instance. And this is a challenge for me, Francisco, that will be working in Gondwana Park study and to understand a little bit more the function and the patterns and processes in the Anyaras kind of vegetation. And for Professor Huntley, what can we do to understand a little bit more the Anyaras?
Yes, the Anyaras Dangot are these plains within the Miombo landscape where you have the underground forests. And interestingly, in 1938, I think it was, the great botanist Gosweiler wrote, and he said that the Anyaras Dangot are going to be a field for genetic and vegetation study for many years to come. So he even at that time was puzzled by what caused the underground forests. And I think that in the last 20 years, research in Angola, it's contributed a lot, perhaps more than anywhere else, to trying to understand the problem. I think the emphasis, though, needs to get more physiological than just looking at the structure, but to do physiological studies, get more sophisticated physiological studies of how these plants work, how they respond to different treatments of fire, herbivory, defoliation, whether it's a nutrition factor or a moisture factor, or even a light factor, because they get covered for some of the year by grass growing up above them. So I've got no answer to your question. All I can say, there are many different approaches that one must use, but it's a fascinating topic.
So thank you. Is there any question from the audience? No? I think so.
Just a question.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Some contribution. We have one person, college in Angola. He started he worked in PhD last time, 2021. Last year in German. He talked the Anyaras what in physiology and ecology. I think his work is very important for for my English is very okay. Yes, my work is for lost. It's not. Yes, the Amandio Gomes. Yes, it's very important for communication. For him, I don't know if he start here or in online, but it's very his contribution is very important for another works, another jobs or research. Thank you.
No, thanks very much. Of course, Amandio Gomes is known well to us. He's worked with us in the field, and he's done very important work. And that's what I was saying, that the recent work in the last 20 years or so, because he's been active there for some time, is very important, and it's beginning to answer many of the questions. Thank you.
So thank you very much to all of you for your presence here, professors, for your great talk. And we hope to see you next week in the next Inconsciencia. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon.
Thank you.